everybody, and welcome to today's April lecture, which is Units 3 and 4 Psychology. My name's Hannah, and I'll be presenting this lecture for you guys today. So I hope everybody's having a really good holidays, had a really good weekend. Hopefully you've had some time to rest and starting to feel ready for getting back to school. So obviously people will still be joining us, which is amazing. Welcome to everybody jumping on, but let's just get straight into it. All right, so again, welcome. This lecture is run by ATAR Notes, which provides heaps of high school resources to high school students to help them really do the best possible that they can in their studies. Even one of the best parts, one of my favorite parts about ATAR Notes is they actually provide a lot of really incredible free resources such as like study notes, lectures such as what we're doing today, online discussion boards, videos, and everything else that you can see, even an online ATAR calculator, which is a really cool resource, and newsletters where we send out information updates, and just, lots of really, really incredible resources that I'd really encourage you guys to, check out. And because, there's a lot of really good content there that can really encourage you to, kind of get that bit higher level of knowledge and, just really get that edge in your studies. So, I'd really encourage you guys to access that website there and have a look at some of our free resources. We also do have some extra resources, which are actually our paid resources, which are actually specifically designed to give you that that extra edge in your studies. So we actually do offer private tutoring sessions, which obviously we do for a range of different subjects. We have printed and online study guides, which you can access in a variety of different ways, which provide you with the notes for the subjects that you're doing. I know that my teacher had a copy of the Units 3 and 4 Psychology study guide, and that was actually a really valuable resource for me, especially when it came to case studies, like providing the really concise, the key details that you really needed to know. So that was actually a really incredible resource that helped me to do really well on my external. And also Ed Unlimited, which provides you with access to all of the study guides in one place. And we also do online classes, like lectures like today. There's just so many incredible resources that I'd really encourage you guys to check out. And before we get into our content, I'd just like to say a quick thank you to our sponsors, which actually made today's lecture possible. Because obviously today is a free lecture because we want as many people to be able to access it as possible to do get that extra edge in their study, like we said before. So thank you to Latrobe, RMIT, Deakin, UTS, and Macquarie, who are really important supporters of ATAR Notes. So that's just a quick shout out to them. And me, like I said before, my name is Hannah, so I thought I'd tell you guys a bit about myself before we get too into things. I graduated in 2021 and I got an ATAR of 94.9. I studied 6 subjects. I did general maths, English, biology, psychology, drama, and outdoor sport and rec. So I definitely had a really good variety, and I really, really enjoyed all of them. Psychology, I was actually really privileged to achieve a 97 out of 100. I lost 1 mark on my data test, and then it must have been around 2 marks on my external exam, which I was really, really excited about. And I was actually awarded the Subject Achievement Commendation, which actually means I got the highest result in Queensland for psychology in 2021. So that was a really, really exciting achievement. And I'm definitely really passionate about psychology, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to share some of that with you guys today, as well as obviously the content that I learned along the way, but some of the tips and tricks and the ways that you can really do the best in IA 2, 3, and as well as externals, which I'm sure is definitely on your mind for today. So, and this year, so I graduated in 2021. 2022, I started studying at uni, and so this year I'm actually in my 2nd year of a Bachelor of Primary and Secondary Education. And I'm really enjoying that. So that's a little bit about me. So let's get into what today's lecture is going to look like. So we have on our screen here, we have what makes up Unit 3 Psychology. So we have Topic 1, Localization of Function in the Brain, which I'm sure you've probably already covered in class. So localization of function, as I'm sure you know, is all about like the location of the function in the brain. So it's mapping out the structure in the brain that's related to the functions, which obviously isn't always straight back and forth because the brain is such an incredibly complex thing, but it's also super interesting. So yeah, that's a really interesting thing that I'm sure you guys have started to look at in class, as well as visual perception, which is how does what we see, how do we take all this stimulus that we're taking in, and how do we actually give it meaning, and how do we actually receive the stimuli and perceive it to make meaningful information out of what we're seeing. So topics 1 and 2, chances are, I'm sure schools are all covering content at a little bit of a different pace, but chances are most people will have had a really good look at topics 1 and 2 so far. So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to focus on topic 3, which is memory, and topic 4, which is learning, which you probably haven't covered quite as much in class yet. So hopefully that'll give you a little bit of a head start coming into term 2. But we do, and further at the end, we'll have a look at some scientific skills if we get some time, and also do a bit of a summary. And one thing I also did want to flag before we get into it is we actually have a chat box below the recording where you're watching our stream today. So if you have any questions at any point throughout the lecture, whether that be about your assessment, whether it be about the content, or even about university or any burning year 12 and beyond questions that you have, content or otherwise, feel free to ask them in the box below, and we'll be standing by popping answers to those in as we go. So feel free to ask any questions as we go along, and also keep an eye out for the resources that we've got attached below, such as the slides for today's lecture, because chances are we won't quite get through everything. So having the slides down below is a really great way to be able to go back through it in your own time. So whether your learning style's taking notes or just listening, that means that the slides will be down below, so you can absolutely go back over them again later and hopefully really get the most out of today's lecture. So thank you everybody for joining us, and like I said before, I think I mentioned we do have slides for topics 1, 2, 3, and 4. But I would actually like to skip past topics 1 and 2 for now and actually start with topic 3. And to try and get that bit of a head start in memory and learning, which can be some quite challenging concepts. So what we're going to do is we're going to skip down past localization of function and visual perception. And we're going to get straight into memory, and then if we have time at the end, we might actually come back and do some quick revision on localization of function and our second topic, which is visual perception. But for now, let's start to have a look at memory. So memory obviously is an incredibly relevant topic, because one of the interesting things about psychology is we're actually not just learning content that doesn't have little relevance to our current lives or lives beyond school. But the amazing thing about psychology, one of the things that I actually loved about it so much, is it's actually relating to our lives here and now and our study. Like, we can actually use what we're learning in psychology and apply it to our study habits, to actually how we're studying and learning information. So that's a really cool thing as well, especially when it comes to memory and learning, which is what we're covering today. So even as we're going, be thinking about one, how this relates to obviously the content you're covering in class, but also two, how you can be applying that to your own study habits, which is really cool. So memory, as you guys would probably know, there's multiple different types of memory that we actually look at in psychology, and one of the models of memory is the idea of sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory, terms that I'm sure you guys have all heard before. So the thing is, with a lot of concepts in psychology, is they're actually very abstract. For example, intelligence. How do we actually measure that? Well, we have IQ, which is an intelligent quotient, which is a number you get from a test that is supposedly a predictor of your intelligence. And a lot of really smart people have done a lot of really accurate testing, and it does appear to be that your IQ actually is a measure, a predictor of your intelligence. But the interesting thing about psychology is, because we're trying to quantify, we're trying to measure, we're trying to define very, very abstract concepts, we actually do often come up with a lot of models. Whereas in biology, for example, we know exactly how a hormone is released and the effect that it has on the body. Whereas memory is this really abstract concept where we're trying to break up what is memory, what is all of these different elements, durations, capacities. So that's why we actually do end up with so many different models, and which is actually why we look at so many of them in psychology. So yeah, we have a really rounded understanding of the major ways that different well-known psychologists view the idea of memory. So our first one, which is our sensory memory, our short-term memory, and our long-term memory, actually comes under the umbrella term of multi-store model of memory. So if you're following on with class learning goals or the QCEE syllabus, I'm sure there'll be a learning goal about the multi-store model of memory. So we're going to have a bit of a look at that now. So first up is sensory memory, which is a store for incoming fleeting sensory information. So thinking about the world around us, there is constantly smells, there is sights, there is sounds that is all coming in all at once. And we would actually be incredibly overwhelmed if we were trying to perceive and make sense of all of that all at once. So our sensory memory is actually a really valuable tool, and that actually prevents us from being overwhelmed by everything that's coming in. And it actually, as information is coming in, it's actually sorting through what's coming in and deeming whether it's worthy to be brought into our short-term memory. As you can see, our arrows flowing through our diagram, which our short-term memory is our conscious memory, whereas our sensory memory we're actually not actively aware of. Information will only be moved from our sensory memory to our short-term memory if our brain is actively paying attention to it. So for example, sensory memory, my eyes can currently see all around here, but my focus is on my laptop and the notes that I have here because I'm focusing on this lecture. My brain would be quite overwhelmed if I was actively trying to process all the titles of my books and all the things up on my wall. And that actually would be very overwhelming for my brain, and I wouldn't be able to be effectively focusing on the lecture because the human brain is actually like we can actually only do one thing at once. We can't take in all the different things. So that's where our sensory memory is actually a really, really valuable tool to help us from not becoming overwhelmed. So the sensory memory actually has two parts, like you can see on the screen. We have our iconic, which is actually encodes visual information. So iconic is what we see, and it has a duration of 0.3 seconds, which is very, very, very short, but it has an unlimited capacity, which is just quite crazy to think about. So think about, for example, if you were at a New Year's party or something, and when people are drawing in the air with the sparklers, and it actually leaves, you can just see the trailing light. That's actually your iconic memory in action, because you're remembering just for that brief 0.3 seconds what it was that you saw there. And then our second form is our echoic memory, which also has an unlimited capacity, and it encodes acoustically. So the word encoding, if you haven't heard that before, refers to how the information is stored in our brain. So iconic memory is stored in that visual mode, whereas our echoic memory is our acoustic capacity for sensory memory. So think about, for example, echoic is actually our encoding for acoustic, like sound, like I said before. So some handy ways to remember that is maybe echoic acoustic, thinking about those initial sounds and how they relate. Or for me personally, the way that I remember it is echo. You think about how you hear an echo, and then you might think, for example, that you see an icon, which is a visual thing. So iconic is visual, and echoic, the echo, is our acoustic, our auditory encoding for sensory memory. So yeah, finding those little tricks to help you remember those things as well is really handy. Like we said with our sensory memory, it has an unlimited capacity, but only a very limited duration. So what we hear and see in our sensory memory fades very, very quickly unless we bring it into short-term memory. And our echoic memory, as you can see, is a little bit longer than our iconic memory. So our echoic memory is actually what allows us to retain the sounds of words long enough to comprehend full sentences. Because, for example, if I was going to say a sentence like, today we're learning about echoic memory, if our echoic memory faded really, really fast, we wouldn't even be able to remember the first half of the sentence, and that would actually interfere with our comprehension of what we're hearing. So that is a reason that our echoic memory does have that slightly longer capacity, which is really, really handy for our memory. So like I was saying before, if we pay attention to what our brain's processing through our sensory memory, the information will actually come into our short-term memory, which is the store of information that is actively conscious. So if attention is paid to the information in sensory memory, it's transferred to our short-term memory, which is the equivalent of some other, I believe it's the working model of memory, refers to our working memory, which is what is actively conscious in my brain. That is kind of the equivalent of our short-term memory. So our short-term memory has the duration of up to 30 seconds. Some textbooks say 12 to 20, some say 12 to 30. So the rough guideline that I believe would get you the right marks on the exam would be that 12 to 20 up to 30 seconds kind of mark. So thinking about the capacity of our short-term memory, it has about 5 to 9 items. Past that, we start to get a bit mixed up. We start to forget things because while our sensory memory actually does have an unlimited capacity, our short-term memory, the things that we're consciously thinking about, it actually does have a very limited capacity. So for example, if I was writing a shopping list, it would actually be much more efficient to write a shopping list than try and remember the 10 things that I've got to grab from Coles or Woolies. So yeah, our short-term memory is a bit more limited than our two other memory stores, but it's also a really, really important part of the memory process. And then finally, we have our long-term memory, which if information comes into our sensory memory, if we pay attention to it, it enters our short-term memory. And then if we add meaning to it, if we encode it, if we actually file it away in our brains, the information actually enters long-term memory. And the amazing thing about long-term memory is the duration and capacity. So the duration being how long the memory can last, and the capacity being how many memories, how many items can we hold. It's actually virtually unlimited, which is just an incredible thing to think about, how the incredible capacity of the human brain. Like thinking back to, for example, if you're going for a walk and you smell a really nice smell, it might take you right back to a memory of early back in childhood that you hadn't even thought you remembered, which is kind of linking in the idea of how important cues can be in activating those long-term memories. So yes, info needs retrieval to bring it back from our long-term memory into our short-term memory. So that's our multi-store model of memory, which is one of the processes, one of the memory models that, we really do look at in psychology. So moving on, next we actually have types of long-term memory. We actually do have a few types of long-term memory that we're going to have a look at. So looking back here, we have our sensory memory, our short-term memory, and our long-term memory. And now we're going to have a look at our types of long-term memory. So at the top of our diagram, you'll see that we have long-term memory. The two sub-branches from there is explicit long-term memory and implicit long-term memory. So our explicit memory is memories of facts, names, images, and events. It can actually also be called declarative memories as well. The two terms can be used slightly interchangeably. So it's the conscious retrieval, memory and recall, recognition, and it's the responsibility of the hippocampus. So explicit memory, think explicit, think facts, names, images, and events. So explicit is very factual, the things that you know. So for example, if on an exam you were asked, what are the types of long-term memory? If you could say it is explicit and implicit, that would actually be an example of using your explicit memory, such as would be like naming the countries of the world, and all of those, facts and images, names, events, all of those are our explicit memory. Whereas our implicit memory is actually more of our subconscious memory, whereas explicit must be actively used. Like I'm trying to recall this factual information that I've learned. So it's that explicit memory is what we're actively using. Whereas our implicit is more of that subconscious memory of skills, emotions, preferences, and dispositions. It's actually a part of our memory, but it's actually, we don't need to actively recall it. So for example, if I heard a really loud noise, I wouldn't like that loud noise, although that's not quite as related to memory. But for me, for example, one time when I was quite a bit younger, I went on a camping trip and I actually had a really bad pie from a cafe that I went to. I won't name and shame the cafe, but I actually had a really bad pie from this cafe, and I'm sorry if you're squeamish, but I actually did end up with food poisoning and I was actually quite unwell after eating that pie. So So whenever I hear the name of that cafe now, I'm like, oh, and I get quite like that unpleasant feeling, which is my implicit memory, because that's remembering a disposition, a preference that I have. And so I didn't have to actively think about, oh, so what is it that I think about this cafe? It's just an implicit, unconscious memory that comes back to you. Or for example, another common example is riding a bike. You don't have to actively think about, okay, I've got to balance my hands on the bars, I've got to pedal with my left leg, right leg, left leg, right leg. It's just a very implicit skill that just comes straight back to us. So yeah, that's our two contrasting types of explicit memory. Our more conscious factual memory is explicit, and then our implicit is more of our things that come naturally, skills, dispositions, preferences, and that one's actually processed in the amygdala and possibly the cerebellum as well. Or for example, if you're very musical, that could even be an example of implicit memory, because it just comes very naturally. Whereas at the moment I'm learning the ukulele, which is actually quite exciting, but for me at the moment, I'm still not very fluent in my skills. So at the moment, it's very explicit. I have to think, okay, which chord is my C? Which type of strumming am I needing to use? Whereas somebody that's quite fluent in playing the guitar is just going to be implicitly recalling those skills and just playing very naturally. So that's just another example to contrast those two types. So another example, another subcategory that we can see on our little flowchart that we have here is procedural memory, which is implicit. So procedural memory is one aspect of implicit memory, and it's memory for how to perform tasks, skills, actions, and conditioned responses. So procedural memory is literally implicit memory to do procedures. So whether that be subconsciously, I'm remembering how to stir my cake mixture, or I'm just remembering how to ride my bike. That's again our implicit procedural memory, and we only do have the one type there as well. Moving back to the other side of our map, we have our explicit memory, which can be broken down into episodic and semantic. So remembering that our explicit memory is our facts, names, images, events. It can be broken down into our episodic, which is memories or events of or experiences in your life. So for me, thinking back to when I was in year 12, that's an example of retrospective episodic memory, because retrospective, think retro, think old, so think in the past. So retrospective episodic memory is thinking back to events in your personal past. And prospective, think of like prospects, the future, is actually remembering things to do in the future. So I might be thinking, oh, I have an assignment to write for uni next week. That's explicit because I'm actively thinking about it. And then it comes across to episodic because it's a memory, event, or experience. It's a part of my life. And then that's actually prospective because I'm thinking back to the future. Whereas if I was thinking back to something that happened last week, we're coming back to retrospective again because we're thinking back to the past. Finally, coming back down to our last one, long-term memory, explicit, conscious thinking about it, but semantic memory is actually memory for facts, worldly knowledge, or general knowledge. So the example I gave before earlier about knowing geography would come under our semantic memory, whereas thinking about events and facts from your personal life, such as maybe your sister's birthday even, would come under the episodic memory, because there's those two differences. All right, so like I said before a little bit earlier, because memory is such a concept, it's a very abstract thing, there's lots of different models of memory because we actually can't be exactly sure how it exactly works because it's such a complex and abstract thing. So we do have another model of memory, which I believe, is by Baddeley and Hitch, which is actually one of your case studies from 1974. And this is the working model of memory. So the working model of memory is your working memory is the mental work that is occurring at any given time, including how the information that you're retrieving, how your brain problem solves, and how you comprehend all of the information around you. And it actually draws on the sensory and long-term memory. So it's also really interesting to be actively thinking about the parallels and differences between each of the memory stores and models. because that actually could be a question you got in exam. You see, for example, if we go back to our multi-store model of memory, you actually could be given an exam question that says, like, state one similarity or one difference between the multi-store model of memory and our working model of memory. One thing, for example, you could talk about is how in the working model of memory, our working memory is the mental work that's occurring at any given time, and how that's quite similar to the idea of short-term memory in our other model of memory. So there are 4 separate but interdependent aspects of working memory. So Badley and Hitch, so I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that one right, came up with the working model of memory. And like I said before, that's the mental work that's occurring at any given time. So currently, I'm thinking about the working model of memory. So that's what's in my working model of memory. Or if I was in biology learning about cells, I would be actively thinking about cells, which would be what would be occupying my working memory. So the central executive, the episodic buffer, visuospatial sketchpad, and our phonological loop are all interrelated parts of our working memory. So the first part of our working memory is our phonological loop. And then thinking about breaking our word down, we have phonological loop. Think phono, think phone, think talking on the phone, think phonemes, sound. We're thinking sound when we think phonological loop, because phono means hearing, and the phonological loop is therefore the auditory working memory. So the things that we're actively thinking about, the information, the sound information that's coming in when we're looking at memory through the lens of the working model of memory, is actually our phonological loop. So it's the storage of what we hear. So it's storage, and this storage is what helps us to understand and make sense of the sounds that are coming in. So for example, sentences that are longer than a few words, your phonological loop in the working model of memory actually is what's helping you to make sense of the sounds that you're hearing. The visuospatial sketchpad, think visual spatial, breaking down that word to kind of understand its meaning a bit more deeper. This is actually visual short-term memory, and it's actually what allows you to picture, for example, if you were to rearrange the furniture in a room. And the next up is our central executive, which our central executive, as you can see in this diagram, is actually the thing in the middle. It's what combines the information from our separate stores. So the central executive puts together the sound and vision of the working memory, and it actually controls our attention. So the central executive is responsible for shifting our attention between tasks, and it brings in the stimulus information from the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad to make those decisions. So the 3 main functions of the central executive that we have are inhibition, which is actually an element of attention, which is screening out irrelevant material. So that's even another similarity to our sensory memory. In our other model of memory, our sensory memory is actually screening out the irrelevant material, whereas in this model, the central executive actually takes that role. So it's screening out the irrelevant material. That's inhibition. The next function of the central executive is switching, which, like I said before, it's responsible for controlling our attention. And the third one is updating. So as information is brought in from long-term memory or brought in from or into our working memory from the world around us, it actually updates information before recommitting them to memory through the episodic buffer. So say, for example, in maths, you're learning a new concept, you come to a lesson and your teacher teaches you something new about that concept. Your episodic buffer, let's explain the episodic buffer first. Your episodic buffer helps to retrieve information from long-term memory and associate it with information in working memory. So, for example, you come to your math lesson and you're learning about a math topic. Your episodic buffer will actually bring that prior knowledge that you have into your conscious awareness, which is your central executive. And as your phonological loop might be taking in and processing what your math teacher's telling you, maybe your visuospatial sketchpad's making sense of the writing or the symbols that the teacher's written on the board, the central executive is actually combining those 2 sensory inputs and is actually working with the information that's the episodic buffer has brought in from the long-term memory to actually process and make sense of and give meaning to all of that information. So that's our working model of memory. Again, could be a bit of a new idea or concept for a lot of people watching today. So if you have any questions, don't be afraid to put them in the chat box below. And yeah, we'll be more than happy to go through that a little bit more. But yes, that is our working model of memory. So the next model of memory that we're actually looking at, which was proposed by Craig and Lockhart in 1972, which I don't believe is one of the case studies you need to know, but always referring back to the list from the QCEE is a really helpful and valuable way to remember which case studies it is, because they do form an important part of the external exam. So our next model is actually our levels of processing model, which the key idea of the levels of processing model is that memory does not comprise of any specific separate storage. So there's no chronological processing, there's no short-term memory, there's no long-term memory like we see in our multi-store and our working models of memory. But instead, meaning is seen as a continuous dimension. So all the knowledge that we have is just an interconnected, almost mind map in our head. But the key idea is that the deeper the processing of the information, the better chance you have of retrieving it. So for example, if I just met somebody in the street and I was like, oh, hi, what's your name? And they told me their name, and then we parted ways and never saw each other again, and that conversation wasn't particularly meaningful to me, I actually haven't processed that very deeply, and I haven't assigned much meaning to that information. So I haven't processed it very deeply at all. I've only done a very shallow level of processing. So I'm actually not going to be able to recall that information as easily. Whereas, for example, when I'm learning a new concept at university, I actually actively try and engage in deep processing. I'm thinking, okay, what does this mean? How does it relate to the other things that I'm learning? So I'm trying to process it very deeply. You can almost think about it as like a continuum. Like if you're only processing it very shallowly, it's not a very deeply encoded memory, so you may have trouble retrieving that information. Whereas the deeper you process it, the more chance you have of retrieving that encoded information, which is another valuable thing to keep in mind when studying. So when we have a look at shallow processing, we actually have a few different types. We have structural and phonemic. So structural processing is very shallow, and it's remembering the physical features of words. So for example, if I was teaching a young child, because as a primary teacher, I think about these things. If I was teaching a young child to learn to read and write, if I was trying to teach them the word brick, for example, if I told them to trace the letter B and then R and then I and then C and then K, I'm encouraging them to process that word at the structural level. So that's learning words by their physical features, such as uppercase, lowercase, or letters. So structural processing is remembering the physical features of the words, and actually only about 20% of the words are recalled after structural encoding. Because think about if I was teaching a young child this new word, brick or potato, if they're only remembering the physical features of the letters, such as capital case, lowercase, they're actually not going to remember that word because it doesn't mean anything to them. The next level of shallow processing is phonemic processing, which is remembering words by their sounds. And approximately 50% of the words in Craig and Lockhart studies were recalled after phonemic processing. So that's trying to process and encode information based off their sound. So for example, in this particular study, participants were asked to think of a rhyme for the word, or perhaps a rhyme and a rhythm. So remember the word bull by perhaps rhyming it with something like bull, pull. All right, I've got that association in my mind. So now that's how I'm going to try to remember that word. So structural processing, just thinking about, okay, bull, capital B, lowercase ULL, and trying to remember the physical features of the words only resulted in about 20% of the words being able to be recalled. Whereas phonemic processing, focusing on the sounds, the rhythm, only resulted in about 50% of recall. Whereas when we get to deep processing, which the type we're going to look at semantic processing, which is encoding through the meaning of the words. That's actually the deepest type of processing that we can have, which is another really valuable thing to think about when we're studying. Because when we're studying, we don't just want to be thinking about, I've learnt this topic, all right, now I'm going to forget about that and move on to my next topic. It's actually really valuable to make connections between what we're learning and actually give meaning to what we're learning. Because when we encode things in our brain, I think of it like a filing system. If we're filing it away with meaningful connections, it's more likely that we're actually going to remember it because it's more connected in to what we're actually talking about. So, for example, putting a word into a sentence where it has meaning is how we could semantically process, or even making like a mind map and connecting, for example, levels of processing model of memory. How does that relate to the multi-store model of memory? To actually building those connections and those semantic, meaningful connections. And then in this particular study, 80% or more of the words were retrieved after semantic encoding. So we can actually see from this study, like the evidence that they've collected does suggest that structural processing is our most shallow level of processing, and then phonemic processing is a little bit deeper, but our semantic process, where we're actually building meaningful connections, is actually the most effective way to store things in your memory. And research actually found that memory grows stronger the more that it is elaborated and linked to other things that we know well and care about. So even thinking back before to my example of the stranger in the street, if, for example, that stranger confided in me that they were going through a personal problem, I would be empathetic and I would be very caring, but chances are, that might be encoded into my semantic. I might semantically process that and process away thinking, for example, I knew a person that had that condition, and that might be a meaningful connection that I had. Whereas, for example, if a close friend or a family member of mine, if I was having a conversation with them about a similar topic, that's actually has a much higher chance of staying in my memory because there's much more connections there, because that information, I'm encoding it a lot more semantically in my brain. So again, linking that back to study, when we're thinking of a new topic, we want to be thinking about how does it relate to all the other topics I'm learning about. So really making those semantic connections. So that's our level of processing model. All of our different memory models, they all have different strengths. They all have different weaknesses. There's not necessarily a right or wrong ones. There's ones that you might relate to or ones you might think are more accurate, but they all actually do portray memory. It's just they are portraying them and representing them in different ways. So obviously have a think about what type of working model of memory you think might be, I suppose, an accurate representation of how our memory really works. But in all honesty, they do all represent our memory, like I said before, just in different ways. All right, so memory. Even now, we're getting into looking at the amygdala and the hippocampus, which you actually probably would have looked at in localization of function. So it's even interesting to form those connections there when you're thinking about, all right, so in localization of function, I learned that the amygdala, the hippocampus have these roles, and now that we're looking at memory and learning, we can actually be linking it even further and thinking about, so the amygdala, I know that, it's involved in emotional processing. So how does that relate to memory? So we've got our little flowchart here. So this is discussing the role of the amygdala and the hippocampus in memory. So adrenaline, which is one of our hormones, stimulates the release of noradrenaline, which is another hormone or neurotransmitter. And then noradrenaline, once it reaches the amygdala, it actually stimulates the amygdala, which attaches emotional significance to the memory. And then the amygdala signals the hippocampus to ensure long-term storage. So from this information, this little flowchart that we have here, we can see that there's adrenaline has a role in memory, noradrenaline has a role in memory, and we can see that the amygdala has a role in memory in attaching emotional significance to what we're remembering. And then the hippocampus is actually really implicated in long-term memory as well. So memory, the two important brain areas, obviously there's a lot of significant ones, even like we were looking at with the amygdala and the hippocampus. But two of the big ones that we'll also be looking at are the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex, as well as the hippocampus. And yes, so those are the main ones we'll have a look at for now. So the cerebellum actually has an important role in memory, and it's primarily responsible for remembering how to perform a motor skill. So one thing that I always remember about the cerebellum is it's actually very implicated in balance and producing a smooth movement. So the cerebellum is actually implicated in forming and storing implicit or procedural memories. So it's really interesting. You can see we're starting to make the connections between our different learning goals. Because when we were looking at earlier our implicit procedural memories, I mentioned that, for example, like this guy is running or riding a bike. It's actually a memory of how to do something. And our cerebellum is actually implicated in those memories for how to perform that motor skill. So it's a procedural memory store, and each subsequent practice of the skill will help the person to add to their procedural knowledge of the task. So even like I was saying before about how I'm beginning to learn the ukulele, I'm still not quite getting there, but I am making progress. But the more and the more that I practice, the more I'm learning how to strum, the better I'm getting at changing my chords, and the more that I practice, I'm actually getting smoother and smoother at producing the motor skill, which is because my cerebellum, as part of my memory, is actually learning. Oh, okay, so just the more practice I get, it's learning, okay, so this is how we strum. It's the same with when we think of a little kid riding a bike. When a little kid's riding a bike, it's actually a really big, daunting and challenging task. But when they actually get into it and they learn how to ride a bike, like thinking most of us are probably fairly competent at riding a bike because we've had so much practice. So the cerebellum actually activates the relevant neural systems to retrieve a procedural memory, which enables you to perform the task without actively thinking about it. So again, it's that implicit procedural memory that the cerebellum's involved in. All the things that you do every day without actively thinking about, like I was saying, mixing a cake or riding a bike or playing an instrument or even driving a car. Obviously, a car still requires active conscious awareness and memory because of the changing situations around us. But for example, learning to drive a manual car, learning to change a gear is a very cognitively draining and challenging task initially, but once you practice it and get more used to it, it's much easier to focus on the other surroundings around you, which is why it's so important to do your 100 hours, because while we're still learning how to drive, how to accelerate, how to brake, that's all very draining and very challenging at the start of learning to drive. But once our cerebellum gets the hang of how to do these things, it becomes much more implicit procedural memory. In contrast with our cerebral cortex, which we can see we've got our temporal lobe, our occipital lobe, our frontal lobe, and our parietal lobe, but which obviously all have various roles in our memory. But what I actually did want to focus on before we move on was actually our hippocampus. So the hippocampus actually has an important role in memory formation and storage as well. I have a few notes here about it. So the hippocampus is involved in establishing the background information or context of new memories, such as the location and the place of the memory. However, an important thing to notice is that while some storage occurs in the hippocampus, a lot of memories aren't permanently stored here. They're processed in the hippocampus, that meaning is given to them, but they're actually sent to other areas of the brain, like areas in our cerebral cortex, for example, for storage, because there's a lot of different areas in the brain that are implicated in storage. I'm sure your textbook would have a really thorough interconnected list of that. So the hippocampus, unlike other structures in the brain, the cells of the hippocampus are actually able to reproduce, which is actually what enables new memories to be produced in the hippocampus, especially those explicit memories. So when we're learning new things, for example, again, I come back to my geography example. When we're learning new things, for example, about a country, those explicit facts that we're trying to learn, our hippocampus, because it has that ability to reproduce and create new cells, that's actually how we're able to learn explicit facts and memory, because our hippocampus has that ability. The hippocampus is also involved in the consolidation of memory, as well as some of the storage and a lot of that processing. So there's a whole lot more. It's also involved in linking emotion to memory, because it has those relations to the amygdala like we have here. But there's a lot more to the hippocampus beyond what we have time for today. So I'd really encourage you to in your own time and in your own study, and obviously in your class time as well, to really focus and learn as much as you can about the hippocampus, because it has a very complex interrelated role in memory, especially that processing of new explicit memories. So moving on to, we're still in memory, but we're looking at, actually we're up to our types of retrieval. So thinking back to all of our different memory stores and memory types, we had a look at short-term memory and long-term memory, working memory, and a lot of that we were talking about how is information encoded into our memory. So thinking back to our multi-store model of memory, information comes in through our sensory memory. If we pay attention to what we're seeing, through our iconic memory, what we're hearing through our echoic memory, then we can move the information to our short-term memory. And if we really focus on it, process it, give meaning to it, for example, in our semantic deep levels of processing, we can actually move it into our long-term memory. But when we're thinking about types of retrieval, we're actually, how do we bring information from our long-term memory back into our short-term memory, or in the levels or in the working model of memory into our working memory, and in the other memory model, it's our short-term memory. So remembering that our short-term memory and our working memory are often seen as quite similar. So encoding is sending information from short-term memory to long-term memory, and types of retrieval, so retrieving the information, is bringing the information back from long-term memory into our short-term memory, into our conscious thinking. So for example, when you're sitting in an exam trying to remember information, you're trying to retrieve the information that is hopefully encoded in your long-term memory. All right, so we actually have 3 different types of retrieval. We have recall, we have recognition, and we have relearning. So memory actually, our types of retrieval actually has a measure of sensitivity to it, which means that if a type of retrieval is more sensitive, it means the person can actually register the memory even if only a small part of the memory remains, whereas the less sensitive measures require a larger amount of the memory to remain in order to remember it. So you can see that our recall is our least sensitive, recognition is that middle ground, and relearning is our most sensitive type of meaning. So coming back to what each of them mean. So recall is, an example of recall is being able to identify the correct option without being given a list of possible answers. So recall is actually trying to recall it, the information that you have stored in your memory. Pardon me. So with minimal cues as well. So the best example of that is a short response question on a test. You might be given a question such as, explain to me the role of the hippocampus in memory. So that would be recall. So you haven't been given a list of possible answers, but you're trying to recall, produce, write down, retrieve the answer to the question that you're being asked. Now, there's actually 3 main types of recall. which is free recall, which is just remembering as much recall as you can, as much information as you can in any order, whereas serial recall is remembering information in the order it was remembered, and cued recall is when you're actually given prompts. So for example, if I was saying, if the question you were given actually asked you to discuss through the steps of how the amygdala and hippocampus are related to each other, they would be asking you to use your serial recall. Or for example, in visual perception, the 6 stages, that would be a serial recall if they're asking you to do it in the correct order. Or for example, in visual perception, if they gave you each of the 6 steps but asked you to tell the paper what it meant, that would actually be cued recall because you've been given prompts to recall the information. So yes, recall is retrieving information with minimal cues, whereas recognition is actually selecting the correct option from a list of alternatives, which our best example for that is our multiple choice. You're given a list of 4 options and you need to select which one is correct. Recognition is, about identifying that correct information, and it's actually a lot easier and produces more accurate responses than recall. I know, for example, when I walk into an exam and if you see that there's a lot of multiple choice questions, you actually do have that moment of relief when you see the multiple choice questions, because multiple choice questions are not always, but typically easier than our short answer questions, because recognition is, trying to find my laser there. Oops, it's okay. Because recognition is actually easier than recall. So recognition, again, thinking multiple choice, it's actually easier to read the 4 possibilities and pick out the correct one because you're recognizing the correct information. Go, oh, I think I actually might have heard that before. I think my teacher might have mentioned that in a class, or maybe way back in April, I remember Hannah said that thing about the working model of memory. So recognizing from, the list of possibilities, whereas recall is just recalling it. You've got to pull it straight out of your brain. You have to know it because there's not as many cues or prompts involved. So again, that example of a short answer question. And then swinging back to our last one, which is relearning, which is learning something faster and or with fewer errors compared to when it was first previously learned. So relearning is exactly what it sounds. Relearning something that you've forgotten. And relearning something is definitely easier than learning something the first time, because you already, even if you're not consciously aware of that, you do have that long-term, deeply stored information about what it is that you're learning. So for example, if you are very diligent, very studious, and throughout year 12, you actually are keeping on top of your content, you're making sure that you understand memory as you go, making sure you understand learning before moving on to topic 4. When it comes time to revise for externals, well, obviously revising throughout the year is the most valuable method to be producing those semantic connections and getting that deep level of processing to aid with retrieval. When we're relearning, it's actually much easier than learning it the first time because you already have that foundation of knowledge. So even by right now learning about memory and learning today, when you go into your class, you'll actually be relearning it, not learning it for the first time. So it's actually much easier and it's going to come back to you much more quickly because you actually do still have that knowledge there, even if you're not consciously aware of it, which actually, again, links so well into what we're talking about because we're talking about psychology, we're talking about relearning. So by coming to this Head Start lecture and starting to get a handle on these topics before you do them in class, when your teacher starts talking to you about it, hopefully you'll kind of be more in the relearning type of retrieval rather than trying to encode the information for the first time and make sense of it for the first time, which I actually find really interesting as well. So retrieval is how we remember. But what about when we forget, when we actually can't remember what it is that we're trying to remember? Forgetting happens to us all the time. And it can often happen to us when we're actually sitting in ready for the exam, which is actually the most frustrating moment to experience forgetting. Let's see, do we have... yes, we do have some slides on this. So yes, forgetting. So information that can actually be lost in multiple ways. So the main two are encoding failure, or three actually: encoding failure, retrieval failure theory, and interference effects. So the first one is encoding failure. So thinking back to how I told you about how for when an information comes into our short-term memory, our consciously aware working memory, to transfer that to long-term memory, we actually need to encode it. So that's actually our arrow across short-term memory to long-term memory. We need to encode it. If that information isn't encoded correctly, then we're actually going to remember it. We're not going to be able to retrieve it. So even thinking back to our levels of processing, thinking about how if our memory is not being processed at a deeper, at a more semantic processing level, it's actually, chances are it won't be encoded into our long-term memory, because we do need those more semantic, those meaningful connections to connect it into our long-term memory. So an example is if you don't have adequate cues, you're actually not going to be able to retrieve the memory. So a really valuable thing thinking of when you're trying to learn is actually, how can I associate a cue with this? Because that actually aids with retrieval and encoding. So for example, even with our iconic and our echoic memory, thinking that echoic memory, echo sound, because you hear an echo, that's actually a cue that helps with the retrieval of that information. Because whereas if we were trying to remember that using structural process, you might be trying to picture the words echoic equals auditory. That actually might be harder to remember than if you're actually associating meaning with it, which is those deeper levels of processing. And then skipping forward to if our retrieval, if we can't retrieve the information, like I mentioned before, that could be due to an absence of retrieval cues, which is really important to actively try and create those cues when you're studying for exams. And even there's a phenomenon called tip of the tongue phenomenon. So when you're actually saying like, oh, it's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't quite remember it, that is an actual psychological phenomenon, and that's actually a very justified way to feel. It's psychologically studied, it happens to all of us, and it's frustrating, but that's actually a sign you're actually struggling to retrieve the memory. And that could either be because of retrieval failure theory, which means the information is available but not accessible. So the information's there because it's on the tip of my tongue, I know it, but I actually can't retrieve it, whether that be because I don't have the right cues, or thinking back to the ineffective coding, if it's not actually coded, if it's actually not coded into our memory, we actually can't retrieve it because the information's just actually not there. So when we're thinking about our ineffective coding, there's actually two examples. There's pseudo forgetting, which is where the memory, you think you've forgotten it, but it was actually never encoded, so you never actually knew it in the first place. Or disruption to the consolidation process, which occurs when we're distracted or prevented from learning. So for example, if you're sitting at your desk, you're studying, retrieval, forgetting, and coding, and then your sibling comes running in with a really important announcement, and then you actually don't worry, you leave your studies to the side, and if you forget to come back to that, that actually has interrupted the consolidation process. So when it comes time to the exam, if you don't do any more study, you actually go, oh, what was that? I did study that, but you actually can't retrieve it because maybe the information actually wasn't encoded and consolidated properly. And then finally, there's also the interference theory. So the information is available, but it's blocked by interference from similar sounding material. So for example, if you don't quite study your different memory models well enough, you might be asked, what model did Baddeley and Hitch come up with? You might be able to think, oh, I can't quite remember which one because I learnt this one first or I learnt this one second, and I'm just getting them confused. So that's where the interference effects can really come in, because that's when new or old information, it genuinely interferes with the retrieval of your information. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you're encoding information semantically and getting that deep level of processing so that, that's not getting in the way. So memory, how can we avoid this? How can we avoid not encoding it properly or not having the right cues to retrieve it or having all of those frustrating things that contribute towards us forgetting? One way we can actually do that is using mnemonics, which are actually strategies to help improve our ability to encode material into our memory and retrieve it when needed. So mnemonics are, literally what I said, they're the strategies that help us encode and retrieve information. This strategy is the SQ4R method. So you can see we have survey is our S, question is our Q, and then read, recite, relate, review are our 4 R's. So if you get a question about the SQ4R method, that is a mnemonic that is help with, like you can see in our top right hand corner, it's to help prevent forgetting. So there's lots of different strategies that we can have a look at. But at the moment, we're just going to focus on our SQ4R method, which uses these topic headings to help encode material into your mind for example, a text chapter or assignment. So for example, if you're reading a chapter of a textbook and it's just in one ear, out the other, we've all been there. Sometimes it is quite a struggle. I've got a pile of textbooks right here that I've still got to get into, but sometimes just reading a block, a text of information, it actually isn't valuable, it isn't helpful because it just doesn't stick in your memory. It just, like we were talking about, you can forget it because it hasn't been encoded properly and you haven't created adequate retrieval cues to be able to retrieve the information. So, how can we actually avoid that? Using mnemonics, so such as the SQ4R method to really help with that encoding. Like I said before. So survey. Look for an overview of the content. Survey the information. Look for the introduction, the conclusion, or give the text a quick scan if it's a short one, trying to really get that overall idea of what your text is about, which leads to your question. So this is like a cognitive kind of process that you can actively follow through to kind of gain a deeper understanding of the text and try to create those semantic, like that deeper processing and try to get a really deep understanding of the notes that you're reading. So question, what am I reading? Like actively being aware of what actually is it that I'm looking at. Next is read. Read the text underneath the subheadings that you've posed a question for. Okay, so what am I reading? I'm about to read an article about the working model of memory. Well, the next step is actually to read it. And then recite is to recite the text you've just read using your own words. So recite, you might think of a synonym like summarize. So can I actually put this text into my own words? And I know teachers are always talking at school about how important it is to summarize and take notes in your own words. And that's actually a really valid and proven thing because that's actually showing that you're not just copying down and kind of doing that structural kind of understanding, but when you can actually recite or summarize and put it into your own words, you're actually showing that you've got that semantic level of knowledge, like you're actually understanding what you're reading, not just reading for the sake of reading. Following that is our relate, which is relating the information back to what you already know. And like I've been saying, that's all about your semantic encoding, because the stronger the association between what you're reading and what you already know, the more likely it is to remember what you're actually reading. And then review, which is looking at key terms, key information, and then checking if the information has been remembered. So survey, question, read, recite, relate, review is a process it's like a scaffold to guide your thinking to what am I reading? Do I understand what I'm reading? Can I relate it to what I already know? So it's an active questioning that you can use with yourself to really figure out, do I actually know what I'm talking about? And could I, if I was in an exam, could I be able to recall this? So yeah, this is really actually a valuable tool for even your own studies. So yes, you need to learn about this technique for like the psychology curriculum, but it's actually even something you can implement in your own in your own study, which is really, really interesting. So yeah, to guide that deeper level of processing. Another mnemonic to prevent forgetting is rehearsal. Rehearsal, we actually have a few different types of rehearsal. We have maintenance rehearsal and elaborative rehearsal. So maintenance rehearsal is keeping information in your short-term memory or moving it to long-term memory by simply repeating the information over and over. So yes, we have the example of a phone number. If I was trying to learn a phone number by maintenance rehearsal, that just means I'm just trying to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. 1-800-876-278. But the interesting thing is I haven't actually just used maintenance rehearsal there. I've actually used a technique called chunking, which is actually a really valuable, like a improving memory technique as well. So chunking is breaking down the list that you need to remember into manageable or related chunks so that you have a more related group of information to remember, and you actually have to recalling less things. Because, for example, if I was trying to remember this phone number and I was like 1-800-876-278, that's a very long string of numbers. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Like a standard phone number, that is 10 numbers that I'm trying to remember, which is just too much for my poor brain. So by using the method of chunking, actually breaking it up into smaller groups, 1-800-876-278, that's now only 3 groups of information that I'm actually having to recall. So chunking is a principle that the chunk is stored in one location rather than many, freeing up space for new information. So if this phone number was pushed all together, I'd be remembering one digit at a time. But by breaking it into chunks, I can store the chunk 1-800 together, 876-278. So that's actually freeing up more space, especially in my working memory, to remember more things. Again, if I was remembering 1800, it's much easier to forget. But if you do break it into those chunks, then it's actually much easier to remember. Another really good example is a shopping list. Like I said earlier, short-term memory is not very efficient for shopping lists because it is limited by that, up to 30 seconds and 5 to 9 items. But for example, if I was trying to remember this shopping list of about 6 items, that could be really challenging. But if I actually chunked my shopping list, that actually might make it more meaningful and I'd have a better chance of recalling it. So for example, if I had to get lettuce, tomato, carrot, and peanut butter, jam, butter, rather than just trying to remember them all in a completely random order, if I chunk it and think, okay, so I need my lettuce, I need tomato, I need carrot, so they're my vegetables, and I need peanut butter, I need jam, and I need butter, they're my condiments. I'm going to the shops thinking, all right, I need my vegetables and my condiments. So now I'm only thinking of 2 things that I need to remember rather than my initial 6. So by chunking it, that's actually using your chunks as a cue to be able to recall that information. Okay, so coming back now to the idea of rehearsal, we have our 2 types. We have maintenance rehearsal and elaborative rehearsal. So maintenance rehearsal is literally just repeat, 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 repeat. Maintenance rehearsal is actually a strategy to keep information in your short-term memory. If you do it for long enough, it can move the information into your long-term memory. So I'm not sure if I said the wrong one before earlier, but mainly maintenance rehearsal keeps the information in your short-term memory. So for example, with my shopping list, if I was going to the shops, because my short-term memory is limited to 30 seconds and only those 5 to 9 items, I'd be going to the shops thinking, all right, lettuce, tomato, carrot, peanut butter, jam, butter, lettuce, tomato, carrot. That's my maintenance rehearsal. I'm trying to keep it actively in my active short-term conscious working memory by repeat, 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 which is maintenance rehearsal. Whereas elaborative rehearsal is a process by which we give meaning to the information and link it to other information in our memories. So the idea of elaborative rehearsal is that by actually giving meaning to the information, we can actually semantically encode it and achieve that deeper processing, connect it into our long-term memory so that we actually have more cues to retrieve the information. So for example, if I'm trying to, again, learn about psychology, if I want to use elaborative rehearsal, I'm actually going to give meaning to the information. So for example, if I'm trying to learn about memory, I'm not just going to try and memorize or rehearse. Short-term memory is, I'm actually going to learn the definition, I'm going to give meaning to it. And by doing that and undertaking elaborative rehearsal, I'm actually giving meaning to the information, linking it to other meaningful information, so that I'm actually going to have a lot of really valuable cues to kind of bring the information back into like my conscious awareness. Okay, I think we have one more mnemonic to prevent our forgetting. And this mnemonic uses the idea of a house, which is why we have our amazing picture of a house. So this is actually called the method of Loki. I don't know where the name came from, but I always sort of like Loki, like, I actually don't know my superheroes or anything very well, but I feel like Loki has like a castle or a house or something. So how I remember it is Loki, think castle or house, because the method of Loki is a mnemonic that actually utilizes spatial memory to aid in quickly recalling information. So it's actually visualizing what it is that you want to remember in a series of familiar locations, such as your house. So for example, if you were going to use the method of Loki to try and remember your shopping list, the method of Loki, like I said, is utilizing your visual memory and your spatial memory of familiar places to aid in that recall. So for example, if this was your house and you had this big long shopping list that you were trying to remember, and the first thing was eggs, you might picture eggs sitting on the kitchen bench, or maybe eggs smashed on the front door. And then once you walk through the front door, you might turn into the lounge room. There might be a packet of biscuits on the bench, and that might remind you to, I've got to get biscuits. And then you're visualing, all right, next, if I move into the kitchen, there's some butter on the table. So then I'm going to remember that I use butter. So the method of Loki is actually not about, having butter on the table or eggs on the front door. It's about visualizing these familiar locations so that you actually have a familiar association with each thing. So again, linking it back to the fact that when we encode things semantically, when we give them meaning, they're actually more likely to have the appropriate cues and be more deeply encoded in our memory. So because you're so familiar with your house, you can actually visualize it. It's a really familiar thing for you. And by associating one item, or maybe the SQ4R method, for example, you might think of associate a room with each letter of that, although that's not a very practical example. But again, thinking back to the shopping list, by associating the item, the thing that doesn't mean anything, like the eggs is easily forgettable because you're just trying to remember eggs. If you use maintenance rehearsal, you'd be thinking eggs, 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 eggs. But if you encoded it using the method of Loki, you're actually using those familiar rooms to create those associations. So that's the method of Loki, is that kind of that method that uses the visual spatial memory. And again, like all of these different mnemonics, sometimes they work well for phone numbers or shopping lists or psychology content. Sometimes they work for some people's brains and not others. They're just all different. They're all valuable. You might want to use some of them in your own study, but you do need to know about all of them. And I think there's even a few others that we might not have covered today. But there's some really good ones too. Have a look at how we can not forget, which is really, really valuable. Okay, so learning topic for Unit 3. It's actually probably my favorite topic that we covered in senior psychology. So classical conditioning is very interesting. So, sorry, excuse me. So there's 3 major types of behavior learning that we're going to hopefully have time to have a quick look at all of them today. We've still got about 45 minutes together, so I think we'll definitely be able to have a look at those ones. So our first one is classical conditioning, which we're going to have a look at now, followed by operant conditioning, and then observational learning. So there are 3 major types of learning. So our first one is classical conditioning, which was actually first kind of coined by Ivan Pavlov. You may have heard of the famous experiment of Pavlov's dogs, where he actually classically conditioned a group of dogs to drool in response to when they heard a bell. Whereas the first time they heard a bell, it didn't make them drool, but by pairing the sound of a bell with the dog's food, which did make them drool, he eventually actually trained the dogs to drool just to the sound of a bell, which is quite a strange thought. So classical conditioning is about the involuntary association, so it's unconscious, you don't have to think about it, between 2 stimuluses. So we have 3 phases in our conditioning. We have our before conditioning, we have during conditioning, and we have after conditioning. So after the classical conditioning, after the learning has occurred. So we have lots of letters here. I'm sorry we don't have what they stand for written on the screen, but I'll go through what each one of them means. So UCS is the unconditioned, so UCS, unconditioned stimulus, elicits UCR, unconditioned response. So before we undergo any conditioning, so before the dogs underwent conditioning in Pavlov's experiment, the unconditioned stimulus, which is something that naturally elicits the unconditioned response. So in Pavlov's experiment, the unconditioned stimulus was the food. The dogs did not need any conditioning, they did not need any learning. The food naturally elicited an unconditioned response, which is the natural response, which was in this experiment, the drooling. So the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, naturally elicits the unconditioned response, which in our experiment here is the drooling. And then NS stands for our neutral stimulus, which is actually our stimulus that initially doesn't have any meaning. It's just neutral. For example, the bell. It didn't mean anything to the dogs at first. And the neutral stimulus does not elicit the conditioned response because conditioning has not happened yet. So the neutral stimulus is still neutral, doesn't mean anything. But the process of classical conditioning is about associating a desired response with this neutral stimulus. So I know it's a lot of terminology, but we'll definitely spend some time going over that today to hopefully make that make a little bit more sense. So during conditioning, the idea of classical conditioning is that the unconditioned response, so the natural response that's elicited in response to an unconditioned stimulus, so our natural response of drooling and our neutral stimulus, our bell, our thing that doesn't mean anything at first, are actually associated through repeated pairing. So how Pavlov actually did this in his experiment, how he actually classically conditioned these dogs, was each time they were given their food, the unconditioned stimulus, that produced the unconditioned response, the drooling. So what Pavlov did was he paired the neutral stimulus, the bell, with the unconditioned stimulus, the food, every time. So every time the dogs were given food, they heard a bell, and the food was actually what was making them drool. But the interesting change is that after conditioning, the neutral stimulus actually becomes a conditioned stimulus, which elicits a conditioned response. So while during conditioning, our food and our bell are paired, and so the dogs given food makes them drool, but they're also hearing a bell. The dogs are unconsciously pairing and associating the food and the drool with the bell. And then so after conditioning, the result of this actually is that the neutral stimulus, our bell, which actually didn't even mean anything at first, becomes a conditioned stimulus, which is the neutral stimulus after conditioning has occurred. So after we've learned to associate a particular response with it, which elicits the conditioned response, which is your learned reaction to the conditioned stimulus. So after conditioning, when the dogs heard the bell, they actually drooled, even though there was no food, because they had learnt unconsciously to associate the conditioned stimulus and produce a conditioned response, which is actually such like an interesting thing that Pavlov discovered. So that's a quick overview of classical conditioning. Another very famous, very unethical experiment you actually might look at in class that's to do with this is the Little Albert experiment, which is very, very, very unethical. It's actually crazy to think of some of the things that they did in traditional psychology research, which has taught us so much, but is also quite a terrible thing. Because whereas conditioning the dogs to drool in response to a bell, well, some people could see that as unethical. There's no long-term consequences of that because that conditioning can actually be undone, which is what we're talking about on our next slide. But the issue with the Little Albert experiment was that struggling to remember the name of our psychologist at the moment, but our psychologist actually conditioned a baby that had the pseudonym of Little Albert to exhibit a fear response in response to neutral stimulus. I believe it was like a bunny or something along those lines, or a white soft toy that Albert initially was not afraid of, but the psychologist actually like made a lot of loud and scary noises when he presented Albert with the little bunny. And then after the conditioning occurred, Albert actually produced a fear response in response to the little bunny, which was once a neutral stimulus, but it had now become a conditioned stimulus, which elicits the conditioned response, which was that Albert would cry and be afraid. So that's actually incredibly unethical because this psychologist actually trained a little baby to be afraid of a previously neutral stimulus for no reason. And he actually it's actually unsure whether that conditioning process was actually undone. And even who little Albert remains a little bit of a mystery. There was some speculation that he actually died at age 6, but again, because it was all very unethical, it was very unregulated, it's actually quite a mystery and quite an awful thing for him to have done. We did learn from that, but that is a very, very terrible experiment that was carried out, which is why ethics in psychology is so important that we consider that and focus on learning about that today. So there are 2 experiments, just a brief overview of 2 experiments that you might hear in relation to the idea of classical conditioning. So these are the other terminology that I alluded to on our earlier slides. So generalization is when something similar to the conditioned stimulus produces the conditioned response. So an example of generalization would be when little Albert was actually conditioned to be afraid of, I believe it was the little bunny, like a white beard or Santa Claus actually made him cry as well because he generalized the stimulus. So actually a lot of white and fluffy things, my mistake. It was actually a live white rat, not a bunny. But when the stimulus was generalized, a rabbit, a fur coat, and Santa Claus all made him cry because the white fluffy things were enough, even though they weren't the white rat that he was conditioned to be afraid of. He was conditioned to be afraid of, by Watson and Rayner. They're our psychologists for that experiment. So little Albert was conditioned by Watson and Rayner to be afraid of the white rat, but because generalization occurred in classical conditioning, he actually became afraid and produced the fear response in response to similar stimuluses, such as the Santa Claus's beard, the fluffy bunny, and the fluffy white coat. They actually all made him cry whereas previously those things had no response on him and they actually hadn't made him upset. Whereas on the opposite end of that is discrimination. Pardon me, when stimulus discrimination occurs when something similar to the conditioned stimulus does not produce a conditioned response. So for example, if the white bunny had not made little Albert cry, he would have been exhibiting stimulus discrimination. Or for example, if you were attacked by a dog and that has actually caused you to be very fearful of dogs, generalization would mean that you're afraid of all dogs, whereas discrimination would be discerning that you only need to be afraid of that particular dog. So that's kind of the difference between our generalization, applying the response to any stimulus, and our discrimination, which is actually being able to tell the difference and only producing the response that you've been conditioned to produce in response to that initial neutral but now conditioned stimulus. On the other hand, extinction is actually when a conditioned stimulus becomes neutral again. So when the conditioning process is actually kind of undone and you stop producing a conditioned response to the stimulus that was conditioned. So that kind of relationship has stopped occurring. So for example, with little Albert, if extinction was performed, it's not documented whether it was or was not, which is a further ethical issue in this already horrendous experiment. If extinction had occurred, Albert could have potentially gone on and not been afraid and not produced those fear responses in response to the conditioned stimulus. However, again, like I said before, we're actually not sure if that did occur. So the process of extinction means that the conditioned response ceases to occur. The conditioned stimulus no longer produces a conditioned response and the bell becomes neutral again. The bell, thinking back to Pavlov's dogs. So if extinction occurred with Pavlov's dogs, when they heard the sound of a bell, the previously neutral stimulus, if extinction has occurred, then it's no longer a conditioned stimulus and they no longer occur in response. That response no longer occurs in response to the stimulus. And that can happen through repeated occurrences of that conditioned stimulus, the bell, without the association of for example, with the dogs, the food. So if Pavlov had rung the bell with no pairing with the food, the dogs might have eventually relearned, bell doesn't actually mean food anymore, so I am actually not going to drool in response. Whereas spontaneous recovery is actually when a previously learnt but now extinct behavior spontaneously comes back. So extinction would be the bell rings, the dogs don't feel the need to drool anymore, but spontaneous recovery would be one day if someone randomly rung a bell and that conditioned response actually just spontaneously came back. So that's our extinction and our spontaneous recovery if the conditioned response spontaneously comes back. Moving on to our second major type of learning, which is our operant conditioning. The operant conditioning is a little bit different to classical conditioning, and I believe I'll put some slides in on this. Our classical conditioning is association of a stimulus with an involuntary response. So little Albert and Pavlov's dogs were not actively involved in the learning process. The learning was not conscious. It was actually subconscious, whereas the stimulus was just associated with a response. Whereas in operant conditioning, the behavior is actually controlled by the outcomes or the consequences. So it's a consciously learnt behavior in operant conditioning. So for example, say if in high school, I know at my school, we had very strict uniform rules. So if somebody forgot their hat or was wearing the incorrect uniform on the incorrect day, then there would actually be a consequence of that. For example, they might get a detention. So the goal of that is the consequence, the detention, is actually meant to shape their behavior. But the difference is the person undergoing the learning in operant conditioning, they actually have an active role in choosing their behavior. So for example, if a student received a detention, they actually have to choose, okay, I actually don't want to get a detention again. I actually need to change my behavior because this consequence, this outcome is or isn't desired. So our operant conditioning is about our learner actively making choices about their behavior based on the outcomes or consequences. Yeah, so coming back to our operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is a type of learning, like I said before, in which the behavior becomes controlled by its consequences, whether that be a reward or a punishment. So if I'm rewarded for sitting quietly in class, then I'm more likely to want to do that often. But if I'm punished for speaking in class when I'm not meant to, I'm more likely to not want to do that behavior as often. So an operant, which is where the name operant conditioning comes from. So an operant is a response that occurs without a stimulus. So our operant is just our behavior, our voluntary behavior, like what I was saying before. So it's controlled by the person or potentially animal performing the operant, the behavior. So the ABC of operant conditioning. This is what operant conditioning is. So our antecedent is the environment that makes the conditions right for the behavior to follow, and it can be reinforced or extinguished by its consequences. So we have our A, our B, and our C. So our antecedent, our environment, is the stimulus that prompts the response. Behavior is the voluntary response, and the consequence is the outcome. So let's go through a bit of an example to make that a little bit more sense. So if a parent was using the idea of operant conditioning to teach their children, for example, the antecedent, the stimulus that prompts the response, could potentially be if two siblings were fighting. So the antecedent, the environment, is right for the voluntary behavior response to follow. For example, if one of the siblings actually chose to hit their sibling rather than resolve the conflict constructively, that's actually the behavior that child has consciously and voluntarily chosen. So again, we have our antecedent, our environment is a stimulus that prompts the response, which in our example is our behavior, our voluntary choice to hit. The consequence, which is the outcome, the parents might actually put the child in timeout. That could be the consequence. So the idea of this is that consequence actually isn't desired. The child actually doesn't want to go to timeout. So the goal of that is to shape future behavior. So for example, next time a similar antecedent or environment comes up that prompts the response, instead of hitting the child might think, okay, last time I exhibited this behavior, I got put in timeout, which really was awful, and I don't actually want to have to do that again. So I'm going to voluntarily choose to maybe perhaps be kinder to my sibling rather than have to face the consequence if I choose to act in an inappropriate way again. So that's kind of the basic outline of our operant conditioning. So the whole thing with operant conditioning, like we said before, is that our consequences are actually controlled, our behavior, the outcome is actually controlled by its consequences and the outcomes. So our outcomes could be positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, or negative punishment. And these are a little bit confusing, but it's definitely really valuable and worthwhile being able to tell them apart, because these can make for really easy marks on multiple choice questions or short answer questions if you can just kind of grasp what the difference between each of them is. So a reinforcer, so looking at our here's my laser pointer. So looking at reinforcement. So a reinforcer is any stimulus, so the outcome, the consequence, that strengthens or increases the likelihood of a response or a behavior. So reinforcement, like what we have here, is any consequence that says, yes, I want to encourage this behavior. I want to do it again. A reinforcer says, I want you to learn that this is a good behavior and I want you to do it again. Looking across to our positive and our negative. So positive, in the case of both reinforcement and punishment, means that something is added. A stimulus or a consequence is added. And our negative means a stimulus or a desire. So a stimulus is taken away. So our positive, yes, exactly. Think plus, something is added, and our negative, something is taken away to shape the behavior in the desired way. So thinking back now to, let's look at positive reinforcement. So reinforcement, we want to increase the likelihood of a behavior. Yes, do it again. That is a good thing. So positive reinforcement, we're thinking, what could we add to reinforce a behavior? Well, a positive reinforcer would be something like a reward that strengthens the response by providing like a pleasant or satisfying consequence. Keep in mind that when we're talking about operant conditioning, a consequence isn't a bad thing. A consequence might not be timeout. A consequence can be iPad time. A consequence is just referring to the stimulus, the outcome that's trying to shape the behavior. So again, looking back to positive reinforcement, something positive, something desirable is added to increase the likelihood of the behavior. So for example, in a classroom, if a student is sitting really quietly, they might actually be rewarded with some iPad time. So next time in a class, the student might be thinking, oh, okay, last time that I actually did this behavior, last time that I was really good and I listened really well, I actually got rewarded with iPad time. So the goal of that is to actually reinforce the behavior to make the student want to do it again. Whereas negative reinforcement is, again, we have our negative. So that means something is taken away to reinforce, so to promote a behavior. So how do we take something away to promote a behavior? Well, it's taking away an unpleasant stimulus to increase the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated. So for example, if you are being told to clean your room, or a child is being told to clean their room, but they don't want to, if a parent is nagging, the student might actually clean their room to get rid of the nagging. So the outcome of them cleaning their room is actually that the nagging, which is a negative stimulus, is actually taken away, which is to reinforce the behavior. So that means they're more likely to do that behavior again, because the reward, the thing to reinforce that behavior, was that a negative thing was taken away. So that's increasing the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated by taking away the negative stimulus. Moving down to punishment. So when we're looking at positive and negative punishment, we're looking at how can we reduce the likelihood of the behavior. So positive punishment, positive, remember coming back to thinking something is added. How can we add something to reduce the likelihood of a behavior? Well, that would be adding an unpleasant stimulus so a child knows that they shouldn't engage in that behavior again. So for example, adding nagging or yelling. If a child does something really dangerous or really unsafe, a parent might yell or tell them off or something like that. So something is being added so they know not to participate in that behavior again. So yeah, like I said before, like a parent scolding their child for fighting with their sibling. Whereas our negative punishment, think negative, something is taken away to try and reduce the likelihood of a behavior. So again, we're thinking, if I want to send the message that what they've done is bad, how can I make sure that they don't do it again? When we're thinking of negative, it's what can I take away to reduce the likelihood of this behavior occurring again? So for example, that would be taking away a positive stimulus. So hey, because you've actually fought with your sibling and actually behaved really unkindly, they might actually lose iPad privileges. So that's something that they desire. It's a desired or positive stimulus that's being taken away. that they're actually missing out on because they've done a behavior that they shouldn't have. So yeah, zooming back out to the big picture again, our reinforcers are to encourage the likelihood of a desired behavior, whereas our punishment is don't do it again, and whether that be through positive, adding a pleasant or unpleasant stimulus, or negative, removing a positive or a negative stimulus to encourage, either reinforcement or punishment. So that's our classical versus our operant conditioning. All right, our third type of learning was actually social learning theory, which arose from Bandura's experiment with a giant Bobo doll, which you can see on the screen is one of those like inflatable toys that has like a really low center of mass so that you can kick it and hit it and it can move around. So social learning theory is boiled down very, very basically. It's the idea of monkey see, monkey do, or if I see somebody else do something, I'm more likely to do that. Or if I don't see somebody else do something, I'm more likely to not engage in that behavior as well. So what to know about social learning theory? The number one underpinning idea is that people learn through observation, especially when the role model has like a particular power in their life. So for example, if you see somebody you admire or look up to engaging in a certain behavior, you're more likely to engage in that behavior as well. Or for example, I know when I was a lot younger, I had that very much like big sister idolization of my big sister. So if she engaged in a behavior and I observed it, I would have been much more likely to take on that behavior as well. The second thing to note is that mental states are important to learning. So how the learner feels affects how they're learning. And also learning does not necessarily lead to behavior change. So coming back to what observational learning is. It's a method of social learning, and there's kind of 5 stages that we'll have a quick look at here. So the first one is attention. So for the idea of these 5 stages is that if these 5 stages don't happen, social learning does not happen. These are the steps that must happen for social learning to happen. For a child to observe and then all the way move through to actually reproducing that behavior. So learning through observation. So first up is attention. So the learner must actively pay attention to the model, to the social model that they're trying to learn from. So for example, if I hadn't been paying any attention to what my sister had done, I wouldn't be able to repeat the behaviors and learn from what she was doing because I wasn't paying any attention. So it's almost, again, it's linking back to our memory of how can we bring information from our short-term memory into our long-term memory. Well, we have to pay attention. Well, it's the same with social learning. If we're not paying attention, we actually can't store the behavior in our mind. So we're not going to be able to repeat the behavior if we're not paying any attention. And that's also influenced, like I said before, by how much you admire the model, maybe how you're feeling, how much attention you're paying, all of those things. So if attention is paid, we can follow through to retention. So the learner forms a mental representation of the model's behavior. So that also depends on the observer's ability to encode the information. So for example, if I was watching my older sister perform a really cool skateboard trick and I'm like, I want to learn that. So have I paid attention? Yes, I'm watching, I'm focusing. Second is retention. Can I actually retain that in like a cognitive kind of model in my mind? Like, can I think back through, okay, so what was it that she's doing? Am I paying attention? And now am I storing it in my brain? That's the idea of like actually remembering it. Because if you can't remember it, you can't repeat it. Number 3 is reproduction. So the learner converts the mental representation into action, but they actually don't perform the behavior yet. The learner must have the physical and intellectual ability to convert the representation that we got in retention into action. So for example, if my sister was doing a really, really cool skateboard trick, reproduction is referring to, do I have the intellectual and physical capacity to reproduce this behavior? If yes, we can move on to reinforcement, the next stage. But if not, if I'm unable to do this skateboard trick because maybe I'm physically unable to skate, maybe my balance isn't very good, or maybe I'm just really bad at skateboarding, that means I actually can't learn that behavior because I don't actually have the physical or intellectual ability to reproduce it. So for example, if I met somebody that had a PhD in mathematics and they were writing up and solving this really complicated equation on the board, yes, I can pay attention. Yes, I can retain a mental representation of the model's behavior of solving that math problem. But no, I do not have the capacity the intellectual capacity to actually solve that problem. So if I can't reproduce it, we can't move on. But say it is a behavior I can reproduce, then we actually move on to reinforcement, which influences the likelihood that a learner will imitate an observed model's behavior. So reinforcement, thinking back to in operant conditioning, a reinforcer encourages the likelihood of a behavior. It is the same in social learning. So is there adequate reinforcement to encourage me to want to do this behavior? And if there is, then it flows through to motivation. If I have paid attention, if I've retained it in my mind, if I am capable of reproducing it, and if, like in operant conditioning, there's the appropriate antecedent, the appropriate environment, the appropriate consequence, the appropriate reinforcement, then I will have motivation to undertake the desired behavior. And so I will produce it. But if any of these 5 stages are missing, then we actually can't learn the behavior all the way through to not being able to actually producing it. So yeah, with motivation, we actually have to want to imitate it. So for example, with the skateboard trick, I might think it's really cool. I might want to be more like my sister. Like there's all of these different reinforcers that could be motivating me to take part in that behavior, which influences, like whether I will imitate and produce that behavior or not. And if there's a positive outcome of that behavior, then you're more likely to, be repeated to motivate it, whether that comes through praise or from yourself internally or externally from others. And an interesting thing to note is that reinforcement can actually come vicariously as well. So think of the idea of people living vicariously. For example, if somebody else is traveling, you might make a joke that you're going to live vicariously through them because you're not able to travel yourself. Vicarious reinforcement is a similar thing. It's actually when you're more likely to engage in a behavior because you witness the reward or the consequence that another person receives. So for example, linking back to my skateboarding incident, if I saw my sister learning skating really cool, if I saw somebody else copy my sister and learn to skate and they fell over and hurt themselves, that might send a message to me that it's actually not worth trying to learn to skate, which actually might vicariously decrease my motivation. Or for example, if I was sitting in class and somebody else put their hand up really nicely and shared an answer and they got a lolly, a reward for answering that question, then that's vicarious reinforcement because I've gone, they've received a positive stimulus for participating, for producing this behavior. So now I'm actually more motivated to produce this behavior as well. So that's actually getting motivation, not from having direct consequences or reinforcements applied to you, but you're actually learning. So it's bringing in that idea of social learning again by seeing them applied to somebody else. So those are our 5 steps for our social learning theory, which is really amazing. And we're actually going quite well for time. We just have like another 10 minutes together. So I think we might as well go through some scientific skills because we do, while a majority of these would have been in your data test, which you've already covered, a lot of these are actually also will be relevant to your IA2 and your IA3, as well as your external. You can actually bring in some of these scientific skills as well. So scientific skills, central tendency, we have mean, median, and mode. I'm sure you've covered that in class a lot, so we'll have a skip over that. We have hypothesis testing and conventions. All right, so let's get a look and have a look at these. So like I said, we'll skip over that one a little bit. Normality. One of the things that you'll actually have a look at is the idea of the curve in the graph, and this would be seen as a normal distribution. So that's just some terminology to keep in your mind. Hypothesis testing is another thing that we'll quickly touch on. So a type 1 error means that you reject the H0 when H0 is true. But a type 2 error means that you fail to reject your H0 when H1 is true. And hypothesis testing is something that you'll probably go into class a fair bit as well, when you're kind of moving into getting ready for your experiment reports. So I actually might just move past our scientific skills for now. And in our last few minutes, I would actually love to have a look at some exam tips and strategies that we could have a look at together. All right, so some exam tips that we can go through in the last 10 minutes. So because obviously I'm very aware that even though it is only April, your external exam is probably pressing on your mind quite significantly, because yeah, it is a very valid thing to be thinking about. It's 50% and it's actually, yeah, which is quite a large proportion of your mark. And one thing that I'd really encourage you is, yeah, to be getting on top of studying now, because like what we were talking about earlier with our relearning, if you come to external exams and you've not kept up on your content through the year, you're actually going to be learning your content for the first time. Whereas if you're really actively keeping on top of your content throughout the year, then you're actually going to only be relearning, reviewing, summarizing, getting kind of back into your mind when it comes time for exams. And as we learn, relearning is actually much quicker, much more effective than learning for the first time. So I'd really encourage you to be staying on top of your studying and your learning and making sure that you're getting that semantic, that deep understanding. So when it comes time for intense revision, you've already been consistently revising throughout the year. So it's not this big, overwhelming and daunting task, because believe it or not, externals, they're not impossible. Yes, they're overwhelming, but they're definitely achievable with the right study strategy and exam techniques. So finding a study strategy that works for you, whether that's the SQ4R method, the method of Loki, maybe it's flashcards or like little like quiz cards where you can like quiz yourself and check your answer, or like flashcards, or all of these different strategies that there are. Yeah, I'd really encourage you to be starting to think about now how you could even be studying and staying on top of that throughout the year, so that when it comes time for the exam, that you are in fact ready. So I do have some exam tips for you before we finish up for today. And again, remember to drop any questions in the box below, and we'll try to finish answering and getting back to you with all of those in the last kind of few minutes. Yeah, feel free to ask any questions about assessment and the content we've covered. And yeah, so that's just down in the box below. So my exam tips for you before we finish up quickly is to make the most of perusal time. I know perusal can be so overwhelming and daunting because you just want to get straight into it, but you do have to take those 10 minutes to just read over the questions. And I'd really encourage you as well to not be overwhelmed, because if you find a hard question, I know sometimes perusal can feel a little bit like, oh my gosh, there's all of these daunting questions, I don't know any of them. But just really actively remembering to take a breather. That sometimes the first time you read over questions, sometimes it won't make sense, which is why it's completely okay to skip questions and come back to them. Because sometimes things will just kind of settle in your mind a little bit more, and they'll just make that little bit more sense once you come back to it a second time. So perusal is actually really valuable for that. So if you come across a question that's quite overwhelming, that's okay. Break it down. And then if it still doesn't make sense, skip it. And yeah, once you do actually get into the exam, my exam strategy was always start with the questions that you know how to do, because they're marks that you know you can get and that'll get your confidence up too, and it might even give you hints and ideas for the questions that are a little bit more challenging as well. And also write down everything you can think of to get all the possible marks, because you don't know what's going to be on the marking scheme. So you've got to just try and showing that you have as much knowledge as you can. So I don't mean include irrelevant information, because that's actually going to take away from your answer. But for example, if the question is about classical conditioning, even mentioning, Ivan Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs, or Watson and Rayner and little Albert, like I know these things, like that actually there could be marks available for that. And yeah, even really breaking down the question so you know what the marks are actually for. If it's a scientific skill, obviously writing down formulas, defining variables, and all of those things. And one other thing to keep in mind is that life really happens around externals. I want to encourage you that it actually is okay. For example, if there's significant illness or significant circumstances, you can reach out to your school, and there actually are processes in place to really support you if things do go wrong. But hopefully that will not be the case, and things will go really smoothly. And after your exam, you can actually really celebrate, because finishing externals is actually an incredible achievement and is really worth celebrating, because it's actually such a milestone. And obviously externals can be a bit of a hectic time because you have so much going on. It's so much all at once, and it can feel very much like one thing to the next. But it is really important to make sure that you are looking after yourself during this, like that hectic month as well, because if you're not giving your brain the space and time that it needs to prepare before your next exam, if you just end up wearing your brain out too much, you can actually not end up performing to your best ability as well. So yes, work hard, make sacrifices, but also as you're planning your study and as you're preparing for your exams, making sure that you're actually taking the breaks that you do need as well, to make sure that you're able to do as best as you possibly can on all of your different exams. And a big part of that is actually preparing well. So making sure that you're getting on top of your study now, which is a really valuable thing. And I'd just really love to encourage you, just as we kind of come into our last kind of few minutes, that just give it your best. Do the best you can. And especially being psychology is such an interesting subject, and I'd really encourage you to make the most of the opportunity that you do have to learn about it, and really start to be intentionally thinking about preparing for the external exams, but also not letting the weight and the pressure stress you out to the point that it makes you unwell or takes away from the value of learning in itself. So yes, do work hard, but also finding that really healthy balance between working hard and working too hard. So coming back to just a few scientific skills, T-testing, U-testing is all for your IA2 and your 3 with your data summary, which we don't quite have time to go into now. And as well as the voice, but again, this PowerPoint is just in the resources down below. So so make sure you access that. I'm sorry we didn't have a little bit more time for scientific skills and exam and study strategies, but I hope that was gave a little bit of an overview, and I hope we made it through enough content about, we got through units 3, we got through topics 3 and 4, and I hope that kind of just given you a really valuable insight and head start into what to potentially expect in the next few weeks of school. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Definitely check out the resources down below, as well as all of the other ATAR Notes resources, because there's so much out there. Definitely make the most of it. That'll really help you with all of your studies. And good luck with term 2, with IA2s and 3s coming up, as well as externals. So hope you have a really good week, and hopefully we'll see you later. Bye.